forecast, we try to provide a bridge between the forecasting that we do on an everyday basis and the topic of the conference, or the topic of today. The topic is the role that automation plays in intellectual services. And William has already given you quite a bit of information that's relevant to that, because he's talked a lot about the role that offices are playing in the economic growth in all these cities around the country. And I'm imagining as you listen to him, you're thinking about the role that automation is playing in the job creating activity and how that works differently in Santa Clara County versus Los Angeles County, for example. I want to offer a bunch of more slides that speak to this issue. For those of you who have been at these events before, you've heard a lot of this stuff, but it's good to hear it again. So I want to kick this off by showing you this image of the narrow corridor of U.S. jobs. So the vertical scale here is logarithmic, and it's 60 million, 80 million, 100 million jobs in the United States in total. And logarithmic scale turns constant rates of growth into straight lines. So the reason I'm using a logarithmic scale is human beings can see straight lines fairly easily. And in case you can't see them, I've drawn them on there. And I'm calling that the narrow corridor of U.S. Total non-farm payroll jobs. And that corridor has been growing at 2% from 1970 to 2000. And the error bands around there are pretty narrow. They're plus or minus 3% of the total. So if you did forecasting, your error bands would flare out as you went to the right, if you're trying to think about what's going to happen in the future. The facts, rather surprisingly, at least for a long period of time, the U.S. economy was in this narrow corridor, in which there were recessions when you dipped down to the bottom, and recoveries and expansions when you tended to get up at the top of the corridor. And these things were fairly short-lived phenomena in which you lose 3 or 4 or 5% of jobs within a few quarters, and you get them back within a few quarters. Typically not a pathology that didn't last as long as 2 years. Well, the first one that was a little different was that 1990 event. So you can see we had a downturn in 1990, and then instead of having a recovery and getting back in the middle of that corridor, we crawled along the bottom of that corridor until the internet rush came along. We didn't really have a strong labor market until business discovered the internet and the need to have the coolest website, heavy investment in equipment and technology. So I'm trying to get across here, the important point is a lot is being said about this last economic downturn is different. It's a financial crisis, a balance sheet recession. I'm trying to get across the point that things have been different the last three. It really starts in 1990. The first symptom of the troubled nature of the job market is 1990, and then that's disguised by the internet bubble, and everybody could get a job in the heyday of that internet bubble. Then the next one that was different was the 2001 downturn, in which we fell completely out of that corridor. I mean, I know that 2% is not 9.8 meters per second squared. It's not a physical constant that you expect to be always operable. But it was that's the way it was for a very long time. And suddenly something different is happening, and we fell out of that corridor. And now we've had another downturn, and we're way below the corridor. If you think of where we should be, I'm hearing my friends talk about full employment. Full employment, to me, means we get back in that darn corridor. I can't believe how far out of that corridor we are. There's something deeply different and deeply troubling about the U.S. labor market and about GDP growth as well. And that's a big problem for forecasting, because we use the historical record to decide what's going to come next. And when things are so different, we don't know what comes next because there isn't any historical record. And it's a huge, important issue for public policy, whether fiscal and monetary policy is going to have any impact, whether it's going to improve the situation. It has huge implications for education to the extent that education is failing and producing this weak job market. It's a huge, huge issue. And I'm going to get around to the point where my point, which is this is closely connected to the impact that technology is playing in the labor market. And in particular, anything that's mundane, codifiable, whether it's physical or mental, is now being done by electronic equipment. And if it isn't being done today, it's going to be done tomorrow. Every day there's a march of a new job being done by equipment in some way, automation. And unless you can bring something to the labor market that's distinctive, something distinctly human that automated equipment can't do, you're going to struggle. Your job is going to, the wage you're going to receive is going to deteriorate, and the risk that you're going to actually lose that job is very, very significant. So we've already talked about this. David and Jerry both talked about this. There's been a big decline in unemployment. But the thing to look at is employment to population. Unemployment is a psychological thing. We talk about discouraged workers. Discouraged workers are those who don't have a job and have given up, they're not going to look. So a lot of that decline in unemployment is discouraged workers. But the people who call themselves unemployed are wishful thinkers. That's the flip side of that. It's a psychological phenomenon. So you're sitting there unemployed, and the question is, are you looking for a job or not? And the wishful thinkers are still not given up. The robots are doing their work, and they're hoping that tomorrow all the robots are going to be afflicted by some disease, and they'll be able to get their job back. That's wishful thinking. And the problem with the unemployment then is a psychological phenomenon, not a real one. Employment is real. They get up in the morning, they go and have breakfast and go out and do a job. That's the image on the right-hand side. And you can see, in terms of employment to population ratio, we're in a deeply troubled situation with a dramatic reduction in the fraction of Americans employed in that downturn of 2008, and only the slightest little improvement at the end. And then the thing that's important, we don't have to dwell on this image too much, but it's the young people of America who are really afflicted by low employment to population ratios. So pause a moment, and I'll just pause a moment so you can see what's happening. 18 to 19-year-olds, we've never had such a low employment to population ratio. 16 to 17-year-olds, you never had any of that. And the 20, 24-year-olds, you have to go back to the 50s to get to those employment to population ratio. That's the first stage of workforce development. We don't really teach the kids in our high schools or our colleges what work is all about. They learn that on the job. And when we have this huge youth underemployment situation, we're creating a huge problem going forward because we're not laying the foundation for a positive economic growth in those critical early years of life. So something is different this time. And I don't want to hear full employment. You've got all these youths that are not claiming that they're unemployed, but they're not working. That's a problem for the United States. It's not to be dismissed as by this statement about full employment. It's wrongful thinking. And then it isn't, having a bachelor's degree is no protection. So this image gives you the employment to population ratio by the 4 different age categories. It's true that the fraction of employed if you have a bachelor's degree, which is at the top, is the best. You know, it's better to have that than an associate's degree. If you're down the bottom with less than high school, that's a problem for employment to population ratio. But you can see in the downturn of 2000 and the downturn of 2008, unlike historical data, the bachelor's degrees also took a hit. So it used to be you would weigh that diploma, you're going to get a job. That's increasingly not the case anymore. It's different out there now. The youth are being particularly hard hit, but in addition, the bachelor's degrees are starting to suffer from some kind of malaise in which that degree is not guaranteeing that you have a job. So I think every one of our economic downturns has a bunch of what are called our temporary layoffs, where you're working as maybe an automobile manufacturer. It says California, although we don't do a lot of that in California. And then you have a temporary layoff, and you know you're going to get recalled. So a temporary layoff isn't a big deal. It doesn't stress you out. And then you get a recall back to the same job, doing the same work in the same locale with the same skills. That's the normal recession that we had back in the 70s, with temporary layoffs followed by recalls. But this one has a record number of secular adjustments in which you get a layoff and a long unemployment spell. It's not a happy situation. You're sitting there next to the phone hoping somebody's going to give you a call tomorrow and you're suddenly going to get reemployed, but it's not going to happen. It's a secular adjustment. That job is gone. And that being gone means that you've got to do 3 things. You have to acquire new skills for the job you're going to. You have to acquire a new location because you might not be working where you were. But most importantly, you have to have new aspirations because that job you're going to is probably not going to pay as well. And that's what gives rise to wishful thinking and or discouraged workers. And our take on this is that we have this record number of secular adjustments in the U.S. economy. And some of it has to do with a negative trend in manufacturing. Some of it is the natural consequence of a post-industrial world that we're moving into with fewer and fewer manufacturing jobs. I'll talk about that a little bit. We had excess capacity in residential construction. Those jobs are not coming back. So those are secular adjustments. That the one that we're talking about today is a computerization of routine, repetitive intellectual tasks. How more and more of those are being done with equipment, and you've got to bring to the labor market something special if you're expecting to get employed or reemployed. So here's the story with regard to manufacturing. Again, this is payroll jobs. The vertical scale this time is not logarithmic, but it's 10 million, 12 million, 14 million. And the red vertical stripes are the recessions that we've had since World War II. And these things are all labeled V, 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 meaning that in the first stroke of the V, you lose a couple million manufacturing jobs. In the second stroke of the V, you get them back. And all these episodes until 1990 were V, 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 V. And then along comes the 1990 event, which is this sort of lazy U. Again, I'm trying to get this point across that the beginning of the problem was evident in 1990. It's not new, this recession. And then we had a terrible situation in manufacturing in 2000 with a huge amount of job losses. None of those came back. This time we're getting a little bit back. That's durable manufacturing. That's automobiles hiring again. But it's still a huge problem in the sense that we've lost a lot of jobs and those jobs are not coming back. So the critical issue from the standpoint of managing the cycle is that manufacturing has a positive trend until upward until about 1985, and since then it's had this negative trend. And that changes fundamentally the nature of the cycle, and it changed fundamentally the way that monetary and fiscal policy should be organized, because you can't stimulate the economy and bring back those manufacturing jobs. You have to have workforce development. You've got to train those workers and get them into good jobs, probably in different kinds of locations. All those Midwest manufacturing activities are part of the past. So here's the reason that trend matters. Every one of these cycles has a period of cost cutting. Normally in expansions, firms emphasize market share, product innovation, and they don't worry much about cost cutting. It's an HR problem to fire a bunch of people. So they don't do that during expansions. And management energy looks elsewhere. Along comes the recession, and the only way to maintain profitability is to control costs. So the management's going to go through that workforce to identify, oh, these are good, these are not so good, you're fired. So they lay off the least productive workers. That's the first stroke of the V. And when you hire back, you don't need to hire back so many because you get the improvement in productivity that comes from the selectivity that occurred. So you fire a lot and you hire some back, but if you lay on top of that cost-cutting cycle a positive trend, those things add up to the V, the comfortable V, that makes fiscal and monetary policy seem as though it matters because it's introduced when that second V is about ready to occur, second stroke of the V. But on the other hand, if you take the cost-cutting and add to that negative trend, then you get this kind of lazy U, the kind of situation that's not amenable to fiscal and monetary demand management. It's a workforce development problem, fundamentally. We need to get these manufacturing workers new jobs and with new skills and locations. But the thing that really worries me is that aliens are taking the jobs of Americans. And they work long hours without complaint. They're happy with low pay. They don't care about working conditions. They aren't interested in joining unions. Most importantly, they don't fall in love, which is extremely disruptive in the workplace. What are they? They're the microprocessors. A huge difference in the labor market outcomes that are occurring. And so I'm going to pick on my friend Jerry, because Jerry thinks that all technology is the same, and I'm like a Luddite to worry about the technology that's occurring now, that people are going to find new jobs. We've had improvements in technology for 3 centuries, and we've always put people back to work. And my message is this time it's different. So the way I want to express the way that it's different is by asking the rhetorical question, is a personal computer like a forklift or like a microphone? So the forklift is a symbol or the symptom of the industrial age. It represents the kinds of innovative equipment that occurs during the industrialization of America. And what that does, it makes you and me equally productive. No matter how strong you are, you might be 10 times stronger than me, but if with a little bit of training and driving that forklift, we become equally productive. So that means huge improvements in productivity because of the forklift, but also you eliminated the genetic difference between you and me. We're going to get paid the same amount on the factory floor. And that's what happened in the industrial age, because we moved out of the artisan shops where skills were extremely important. You had this hierarchy beginning with the apprentice up to the master. Skills were extremely important. All that skill was embodied in the equipment. You had a huge de-skilling of manufacturing and enormous increases in compensation because of productivity that occurred. So it's forced for higher wages and income equality. The microphone, we know about that here in the state of California, because if you, in 1800, an entertainer, a singer, could have an audience that was probably not much bigger than this. Every local community had some singers. The big cities like Berlin or Vienna might have the truly exceptional singers who would make more. But what the microphone and the recording devices allow is for that individual who has a talent and works hard, that individual can have a huge marketplace, can sing to the whole globe. And it has the impact of concentrating earnings on the few who win that game with their talent and their hard work. So the microphone, unlike the forklift, the microphone has enormous impact on productivity of the workforce in that sector. But it's a huge force for inequality, and it tends to produce wishful thinking or discourage workers who work as waiters in Los Angeles restaurants, hoping that someday they're going to hit it big in this entertainment area. So what I worry about is that the personal computer has a little bit of the forklift, but mostly it's a microphone. A little bit of forklift means you don't need to be able to read and write in order to, or count to have a McDonald's job. All you have to do is recognize a hamburger on a cash register and hit that, and then the equipment does the rest for you. But I think in easy intellectual services, they're eliminating the mundane intellectual activities, and it's the talented people, the creative people in these activities who are really using the equipment to produce value in this post-industrial world we live in, and it creates a hugely unequal kind of outcome. Like the microphone creates here in Los Angeles, a hugely unequal income distribution in the entertainment business. So here's a complicated slide I'm going to talk about, which I think embodies the role of the microprocessors in the workplace of the United States. So the horizontal is the business total hours worked. It's not hours per week, so it's not 40. It's accumulated over all Americans. It's an index. It's arbitrarily set to 100 at some point, total hours worked. The vertical is total output in the economy. So I'm going to show you the actual data. So you're supposed to be imagining this moving from the origin in a northeasterly direction, with both hours and output increasing over time. Then you have up here in the upper left a cost-cutting cycle, like I said before. So in these economic downturns, the hours are cut more dramatically than output. Then it turns around and you get both moving. By the time you get back to hours that you had before, you have more output. That's a productivity improvement in that little wiggle. You got this? So we're going to see those wiggles occurring over and over. That's the 1948 event with the wiggle at the beginning. You can hardly see it, but that's that cost-cutting wiggle, and you're up and running with both output and jobs growing. That's 53, that's 57, 60, 69, 70, 73, 80. And that's, I don't know how well you can see that. That's the 1990 event. Can you see that the cost-cutting cycle is a little bit bigger in 1990? That's the message I was trying to get across before, which is 1990 is when you start to see the change in the labor market. Then this is, I got ahead of myself. No, that's the 2001 event. The 17%, that's a 17% improvement in productivity because of that cost-cutting cycle in 2000. And here we are today with another big cost-cutting cycle. So there's two things you got to see that are different now. One is the cost-cutting cycle is totally huge compared to what it was. But most importantly, in the 20th century, it was all output and hours rising together. The 21st century, it's all output and no hours. That's a computer doing the work that humans used to do. Humans are part of the 20th century world. We don't need them in the 21st century anymore. So on that note, I downloaded this off of Business Insider. What's the probability your job will be taken over by a robot in the next 20 years? And I was distressed to see economists have a 43% probability, but then I noticed the recreational therapist. I kind of think of myself as a combination of an economist and a recreational therapist. And then Dilbert has opinions on this. My 12-year-old son wants to know what career would prevent him from being replaced by a robot. I've met your son, and I'm pretty sure he could be replaced by a hammer. This took an ugly turn. Maybe the robots can use him as furniture. So I think we're going to have a period of question and answer now. Thank you very much for your attention.